Sean Fogler is the Community Outreach Coordinator at the Pennsylvania Harm Reduction Coalition, a person in long-term recovery, physician, and certified recovery specialist. He has over 15 years of experience in the healthcare industry working as a physician and with patients, administrators, and insurance organizations. This is the second part of the interview, so make sure you listen to part 1 first. In this portion, we start off discussing how to effectively help friends and colleagues with substance use disorders, the importance of language in this area, and then he tells his story.
Welcome to the Physician's Guide to Doctoring, a practical guide for practicing physicians. Dr. Bradley Block interviews experts in and out of medicine to find out everything we should have been learning while we were memorizing Krebs cycle. The ideas expressed on this podcast are those of the interviewer and interviewee and do not represent those of their respective employers. And now, here's Dr. Bradley Block.
We need to build a better system, and we can do it. We can do it. It's just the willingness to do it, right? But it starts with valuing individuals that have a disease, if we really believe it's a disease, because I think the way we act a lot of times is that it's still a moral failing, right? And we know that's not the truth.
I hear you spoken a lot about the importance of personal connection in recovery and the importance in your recovery, and you just talked about that now. So some things I like to have in the podcast are like advice for people. So let's say I had a friend in recovery, right? My relationship with him or her would be important. What can I do for that person? What should I be looking for? What should I be concerned about? What should I be doing to best help my friend, my colleague in recovery?
I think it starts with just having open and honest conversation. I think a lot of us, we're afraid to ask, and it might not be just because we don't want to know, but maybe, depending on the answers, we won't know what to do. And, as healthcare professionals, we want to fix things. We want to make things better. And I always say, substance use disorders or addiction is one of the most complex diseases out there, right? It affects everything, psychological, biological, spiritual, and it manifests differently in different people. And what works for one person, doesn't work for another. So I think, having honest conversations. Hey, how are you doing? How are you feeling? Does this bother you? And because connecting, having people around you that love you and support you and you're really connecting in an open, honest way, that's been the most important thing to my recovery. And many of the people I know in recovery, that's what it's all about. So open, honest connection.
It sounds like you said, be okay that you're not going to have answers for them, right?
Yes.
It's going to be, as physicians, it's going to be uncomfortable for us if we have a friend going through something and we can't help them. But it sounds like the helping them is the listening. You have to get past your own discomfort with the fact that you don't have answers for this person. Get over yourself. Just
right.
Ask them and just listen.
Yeah, that really, that's it in a nutshell. We don't have, we're human. We don't have all the answers. Bad things happen. People struggle. We all struggle, whether it's in recovery or out of recovery, whatever it is. We all have struggles, and there aren't always answers, or the answers that are there aren't good answers, or the answers we want to hear. And it's being okay with not being okay. It's being okay with not having the answers. But I think just, having real authentic conversations and taking the time to listen, because most people don't listen, right? Or when they're listening for what they want to hear. And that's part of it. And it also comes down to the whole idea of asking that person, what do you need? How can I help you? What will make things better? And we might not like what we hear with that either, but I think it's really important to honor, their own, self-agency and because recovery is a process of change, and it's not our recovery. And, that's the problem with some of these like 12-step programs and, back to physician health programs. They have a long list of requirements of what you're supposed to do. But, that's just dictating what we think recovery should be, or that, and maybe that's not, now, for healthcare professionals, it is an abstinence-based program, but abstinence is not always the outcome or the goal of somebody, of an individual, right? And that doesn't mean they're not healthy. Now, obviously, if you're practicing medicine and you're in one of these programs, you have to be abstinent. There is no choice. But if you do have a friend that struggles and, maybe they were using cocaine, maybe they were smoking marijuana, but they're not, they're only drinking now. Many people would look at that and say, you're not in recovery. You're not doing what you're supposed to do. But, a couple drinks a day, you're going to work, you're taking care of your family, you're connected. I mean, that's recovery for some people, right? So it's not all or none. It's not binary, and it's meant like the process of recovery is not a straight line. It's frequently very chaotic and there's a lot of ups and downs. And I think the other thing I would say is be patient, because it's not a straight line. And just like life, it can be a very bumpy ride.
I think you just answered my next question, which was if you were giving a lecture to medical students, knowing that some of them will inevitably face a substance use disorder, some of them will face addiction, and they'll know people as well. Some of them will be that person, some of them will be colleagues and friends with that person. What would be some of the highlights of that lecture? And I think you just answered that, right?
Well, I answered a little bit. I answered a little bit of it. I think, and it's interesting. I was just at Jefferson Medical College giving a talk to some medical students. So I'll kind of give you an outline.
You're lined up. Perfect.
Well, yeah, and this was just a few weeks ago. But I started out with, we need to have honest conversations, which I said before. Because we don't. We have whitewashed, glossed over conversations about these issues. We need to hear the truth. When I started speaking to the students, I talked about the nature of our current crisis, of substance use disorders in this country, a little bit about the history, the data, which is very, enlightening. And also that, the current crisis we have isn't just, we call it an overdose crisis and, a crisis of addiction, but, we also have a crisis of communicable diseases, right? HIV and hepatitis C and, how all this stuff is wired in and connected to social determinants of health, because really all this stuff touches on, racist drug policies. It's everywhere. And I always say policy is worse than the disease, and the stigma and the attitudes are worse than the disease, because it's just, people with substance use disorders are some of the most marginalized people in our society, and they suffer. And I think when students understand that, they can become a little more compassionate. And I think, as students, eventually they're going to engage with people with substance use disorders and that have these struggles and challenges. And so, there's so much stigma, that's just built into our culture and our attitudes. And I think, giving them some insight into that and how to speak to people, right? Even using the word addiction versus a substance use disorder. There's a big difference there, right? Or relapse versus recurrence of use. There's a whole thing about language, and I always say language is a reflection of what we think and believe, right? And a lot of times how we engage with people, how we talk to people puts up a huge wall, and we don't even know we put up the wall. And then we wonder, well, why isn't this person being honest with me? Right? Well, why would they? They don't trust you, right?
My first question in this interview was, how common is addiction? So you're saying what I should have said was, how common is a substance use?
Substance use disorders, right? And that's a whole other talk, And I'm not the language police, but Robert Ashford, who is a friend of mine, and he's an addiction scientist here in Philadelphia. He's done all sorts of research on this, and there's pretty dramatic, the bias between saying somebody has an addiction, versus substance use disorder. It's dramatic. he's looking at all this stuff, and it's pretty amazing. Like, we dehumanize people with our language, right? We marginalize them. We keep them at a distance, and we don't even know we're doing it. Because I even catch myself nowadays. Even things like, the urine was, in terms of urine drug screens, the urine was clean versus dirty, right? Well, if your urine's clean, people with dirty urines are bad people, right? And it should be positive and negative. And these are like small, little, subtle things, but they make a big difference.
A while ago, I did an interview with Stephanie Sogg, who's a psychologist at the Harvard Weight Center, about the use of language in patients with weight issues. And that's what the entire conversation was about. It was just about how your words, the language shapes your thoughts, and the language that you use influences the thoughts of those around you. So just by doing something as simple as changing the language you use can influence the way people think about things.
Yeah. And that leads to, we talk about stigma, discrimination. And I mean, it touches everything. So I think teaching students about language, stigma, oppression, all these things is really important. I think one of the important things for students to understand is that the mindset of prohibition and the drug policy we have in this country has caused our drug supply to be poisoned, right? And make it more dangerous. And that's just something that's happening. And changing policy needs to be done, but that's a monumental feat, and it's going to take time. But until then, I think they need to understand harm reduction, the philosophy of harm reduction, right? Why it's important to supply people with naloxone, when you're prescribing opioids, or if they have an opioid use disorder and they're using these drugs. I think, we need to supply people with, teach students about drug testing equipment and how people can test their supply, because it's been shown, they've done research at Brown and at Johns Hopkins and shown that people who use drugs want to be able to test their drugs and will actually change their behavior depending on what those tests show. I think they need to understand Good Samaritan laws, and then I would, tell them a bit about me and my story and how I got there, got to where I'm at today.
I think that's a great segue. I think this is right, because our intention was for you to tell your story towards the beginning, but I think this would be a great time for it.
Sure.
So
please
tell us your story.
So I came to the United States. I'm actually originally from Canada in the mid 90s, and I came here for medical training, and ultimately, my journey ultimately took me to medical school. Which is something I always wanted to do. And I actually started out, surprisingly, in podiatry school. And I actually did 2 years of podiatry before I went to medical school, which I don't usually talk about. But I didn't really like feet. And so I ended up in medical school. I know. I've had kind of a long, winding road. But
yeah, you ended up as an anesthesiologist. And if people had trouble finding, a vein, you were there at the feet.
Right.
You were able to get access there because you knew the anatomy a bit better than everybody.
Exactly. And so when I finished medical school, one of the most of my family is in finance, works in finance. And I thought that I could meld, my scientific knowledge with the finance industry. And I wanted to actually research pharmaceutical companies, and provide that information in the finance world. And so I went and actually worked for a couple different firms in New York. And this was around the year 2001, which for me put me next to the World Trade Center during the 9/11 attacks. And I had, as a kid, I had used substances, but, I smoked a little marijuana. I drank a bit, but I never, substances weren't a thing for me, really, ever. And I was pretty athletic through high school and early in college and played sports and ran track. And it just wasn't something I thought about. But after the 9/11 attacks, and I was there, I worked about 3 blocks away, I developed PTSD. And it's really interesting because I was so, I guess, traumatized and disconnected that I didn't really have any insight into the extent of the trauma and how it affected me. And when I look back on it, like I remember that day very vividly. I remember moments during that day when I thought that I was going to die. And I also remember a specific moment where something changed in my head. There was almost like a switch went off, and everything was different from that point on. And it's really interesting. I always say like trauma is at the root of, I think, the majority of people with substance use disorder. And that trauma doesn't necessarily have to be something catastrophic or massive, like I went through. I think it can be subtle things, and it depends on the individual. And something that, you and I wouldn't have an issue with, somebody would. And so, trauma was at the root of my substance use disorder. And initially, I went back to work. I knew I wanted to get out of New York. And eventually I applied for residency, to go back to residency, because I had initially matched after medical school. And then I reapplied 2 years later, and I came to Philadelphia for a residency in anesthesia. And I really was just floating through life and going through the motions. And amazingly, I think part of the way I coped was just working really hard. And I threw myself into work, and I was I was a really good resident. In fact, I was nominated for a teaching award during my internship. And I did well. I moved into my anesthesia training, and, early on, I knew things weren't right, and I definitely had some depression. And I went to a couple physicians, and I was prescribed some antidepressants, and I tried a couple different ones, and I didn't like it. And probably like a year into training, I was introduced to cocaine, and cocaine made everything better. I mean, it really, it just changed everything. I felt great. I felt energized. I wasn't down. And really the first, probably few years that I was using it, it was pretty intermittent and casual, but it helped a lot. And so between work and a little bit of drug use, I moved through residency, and I finished residency, and I was successful. And I actually, when I finished residency, I got a spot as a fellow in critical care medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, which I didn't actually do. I got the spot, and I decided like last minute, I'm going to go into private practice. But I think looking back on it, I kind of regret that I didn't do it. I think part of the reason why I didn't do it is I didn't think that I would be able to act the way I was acting, use drugs the way I had started to use drugs, and get away with it there. And so, I just, looking back now, I can see that. At the time I didn't. I just was like, oh, that's not for me. I think I'm going to go, I just want to make money and go into private practice. And so I did, and I was doing well in private practice, and I practiced for about 10 years. And, bit by bit, sometimes I wish something catastrophic happened earlier, but it really didn't. Like, this was a very slow, progressive kind of dive into the abyss. Like, it wasn't like, I got PTSD and everything fell apart, my life fell apart. I was able to hold it together. And I think because I was successful and I was making money and I had good jobs and I did really well at work, everybody thought everything was fine. And I think like that, I think that's one of the huge risks for us, like as medical professionals, as healthcare professionals, when you're doing well and you can dress it up and kind of wear the mask, everybody thinks things are great. In fact, many people look at you and are like, oh, that guy's got it all, or that girl's got it all. They're doing all the right things, they're doing great at work. Look at the car they're driving, look at their house they live in. The kids are at great schools, but that doesn't mean everything's fine. And for me, it definitely, I was not fine. And really
when did you realize that you weren't? Because you mentioned like the slow descent, and it seems like it's so gradual that you can kind of rationalize everything.
Right. Exactly, which is exactly what happened. And even like my wife, I think she tolerated a lot of my behavior, which years later from talking to her, like she knew something was wrong, but she tolerated it because I was going to work every day. I was making a lot of money. It seemed like everything was fine, on the surface. She knew something was wrong, but clearly it wasn't bad enough that real bad things hadn't started to happen yet. So she, in some ways, not intentionally, just allowed it to progress and didn't really call me out and just was like, well, okay, this is how it is. And went along, and that's no fault of hers, right? And also, she, the people around us who love us don't want to believe that you're sick, that something is something really wrong is going on, which she knew, right? Her instinct was telling her. And it wasn't until I would probably say so I went to rehab in the spring of 2015. And I would say the year before is when things really got bad. I had started a practice with another colleague of mine. So I was making my own schedule, but I was not working as much. And some of my bad behavior started to come out. And the drug use was just escalating. And I eventually met this woman who had a substance use disorder far worse than me. And that was like the person I hung out with to do drugs, and she wasn't in my circle, and I figured it was safe. Of course, that logic didn't make any sense whatsoever. And I remember standing in my kitchen. This was I don't know, maybe March or April of 2015. And my wife holding my son, who was very young at the time, less than a year old probably, and saying to me, I don't even recognize you anymore. And me replying, what do you mean? It's me. And that's the first time I realized, wow, something's wrong. I don't even realize that I'm a different person. And that was it. That's what I was like, okay, I'm ready to go away. I need to get help. And that changed everything for me. So I voluntarily went away and I spent 4 months down in rehab. I went to a place in Florida, and then I went to a place in Kentucky for a couple weeks that specialized in PTSD. And it was amazing. I mean, it was incredible. And everything changed for me. Everything changed, the way I looked at the world, the way I interacted with the world. I mean, it wasn't a straight line. At that point, my wife was ready to leave me, pick up the kids and go. But when I got back, and she saw the change, she hung around, and having that support was really crucial early on. I mean, it was so important. I always say I don't understand how other people that don't have the love, support, the resources around them are able to recover. Because recovery itself it's like climbing Mount Everest. I mean, it's definitely the toughest thing I've ever done, hands down, but the most rewarding. And so I got home and I didn't work for probably another 4 or 5 months. I was going to meetings constantly. I dove into recovery. I was exercising. I was spending time with my kids. I mean, things were good. And then I got a job practicing anesthesia again, and I started to work again. And work was great. And yeah, I mean, I had that purpose back. And because of my entire experience, I decided that I didn't know if I was going to switch specialties entirely, but I figured, I could do a little anesthesia and also practice addiction medicine. So I applied for a fellowship at Caron Treatment Centers with Reading Hospital here in Pennsylvania, which is they're like the Hazleton, Betty Ford, kind of over on the East Coast here. And I secured the fellowship. They had one spot, and unbelievably I got it. And I was super excited. And there were so many great people there. And in July of 2016, I started the fellowship. And 3 weeks into the fellowship, I was arrested for writing some prescriptions to the individual that I was hanging out with in 2014. So about 2 years before, I had written about 7 prescriptions to this girl. And that was awful. I mean, that was I was like, how can this even be happening? I mean, this is just, and it was very shameful. You had
made it to the top of Everest.
I had made it to the top. Right. I had made it to the top, and then, I got whacked, I got knocked down, lower than where I started before. And, we don't talk about this, but as physicians, and we are high profile, and we are in the line of, especially with the current overdose crisis and with what's going on with opioids. I mean, we are in the crosshairs and we don't even realize it. And so I was considered high profile, which is ridiculous because, to me, I wasn't running a pill mill and all this. I was like, okay, I definitely did some stuff that was wrong. I accept responsibility. But the prosecutor in the county, and this isn't, Philadelphia. Philadelphia is a very different place than the rest of Pennsylvania. And, our district attorney here is Larry Krasner. He's extremely progressive. I mean, this city's doing some amazing things in terms of criminal justice reform, in terms of the opioid crisis, which we have a massive problem here. But if you step outside this county, which is where I was prosecuted, the mindsets are extremely narrow, and very fixed. Many of these counties view substance use disorders as a, moral failing. If you are a doctor, right, they want you because they want to show they're doing something. And this prosecutor, the line that I kept hearing, and my prosecution went on for 2 years. So from 2016, so my license was suspended, immediately. And for 2 years, I basically was waiting around. And what I kept hearing was the prosecutor was like, "You're a doctor. You should have known better." Right? Over and over. And I was like, man, I wish it was that easy. Like if that was the case, doctors wouldn't have substance use disorders, lawyers wouldn't, any professional, anybody with half a brain wouldn't. It just doesn't work that way. It was really all about politics. And as soon as your face hits the paper, they can't back down, right? It's all about winning. It's not necessarily about justice. And so, ultimately that wrapped up at the end of 2018. Luckily, I didn't go to jail, so that was great. But in Pennsylvania, a violation of the Controlled Substance Act is an automatic 10-year suspension of your license, which is outlandish as well. That's a whole other conversation. I'm also licensed in New Jersey, which is usually 3 years. Theoretically, I could have had my license back in Jersey, but when you have multiple licenses in multiple states, they always go with the more stringent one. And I also have a Florida license, which is really interesting. That's a whole other story. But I was recently down in Florida going in front of the board, and I told them my story, and they were considering giving me my license back right away. But, there was a whole political thing. Well, his license is still suspended in Pennsylvania. And so, that's the short of it. And, it was so, the legal thing was so challenging. There's so much shame, so much professional stigma and isolation. And, in recovery, it's all about like connection and getting that support. And the legal thing, that created even more like, isolation. And thankfully, I had some good people around me, the recovery community, the physician recovery community, and I got a lot of support, and it just made my recovery stronger, and then I got connected to the organization I work with now, the Pennsylvania Harm Reduction Coalition, and I'm doing all this drug policy work, and I'm training law enforcement across the state, and which was really scary at first, understandably, and intimidating, but, it's been really good. And they appreciate my story and the honesty. And, I think, one of the benefits is that my story is helping them see this in a different light, which is pretty powerful, and I'm hoping I can, use my story and my experience to change some of this policy and educate people and do different things. And I think, at some point I will try and get my license back. I don't know if I'll ever practice again, but I do want it back. And that's kind of how I got to where I'm at today.
I think it would be incredible if you did that fellowship in addiction medicine, right? All of the people that you get it more than those who haven't been through the struggle.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's the lived experience part. That's so valuable. It's a valuable piece.
And I think Viktor Frankl would be proud, right? You found your meaning, right? In your struggle, you found. Now you're making all of these connections and helping all these other people because of what you went through.
Right.
I think that's
right. And that was the most painful thing. Like when my license was, the face in the paper and then my license getting suspended, I was like, what am I going to do? Like more than anything else, more than the shame and some of my colleagues turning their backs on me, it was like, what am I going to do? Like, I want to do something. I mean, all of us we're high achievers. We like to work. We're smart. We're creative. I was like, what am I going to do? I can't do anything. Nobody's going to hire me. I'm done. And it was like searching for a purpose, searching for a meaning. And I was like, how do I turn this into something that is going to mean a lot to me and mean a lot to other people? And it's, and it wasn't like, oh, this is it. Like, it's just, this has been a slow process, and something that has just, something that's just kind of been born, like just emerged, and it's still changing, right? It's still happening. And I have no idea where it's going to lead. And that's like really scary, but I'm starting to enjoy that because like when we practice medicine, like we're just certain, right? Like you do pre-med, you go to medical school, you do your residency, you're out practicing.
Yeah, we have a path. You follow the path, and if you follow the rules and if you do well on your tests, then everything will be okay. You're safe.
Yeah. And it's comfortable having a path, right? Yeah. And you get far enough along the path, like, the financial rewards are great and the respect for the most part in the community is great. And, you're looked at a certain way and treated a certain way. And then you lose it all. And it's like, what am I going to do? And
I think that's a testament to the strength of your recovery.
Yes. And more so to the people around me. Cause it's not like people are like, oh, you've done so much and you're doing so great. And I'm like, but it's because of everyone around me, my family, my friends, the physician recovery community, the recovery community, guys like you, like having me on, I'm honored and humbled that you would even invite me to speak on your podcast, everything I do. I'm just eternally grateful for. And that's been a massive gift for me because before I just expected it. And even though, I think the core of my character is the same, I've changed like the way I view the world, the way I look at people and things. I just have a whole other appreciation for life and the people around me. And that's a massive gift because I didn't see it before.
I think the work that you're doing is incredidible. I mean, I appreciate that you appreciate me having you on the podcast. That really means a lot to me because I never know who's listening out there. But all the work that you're doing it's incredible. So tell the listeners where we can find you and follow all the great things you're doing. Tell us about your podcast and any online presence that you've got.
Sure. So myself and another nurse in recovery, Bill Kinkle, have a podcast called Health Professionals in Recovery. I think we have 6 or 7 episodes now, and it's for everybody, but it's focused on healthcare professionals. And we're trying to speak openly and honestly about, substance use disorders and the challenges as practicing healthcare professionals. Something that most health professionals that are in recovery are not out there speaking. And so we're trying to open that up. I work for the Pennsylvania Harm Reduction Coalition, so PAHRC We do a lot of drug policy work, advocacy work, harm reduction training, public health. We work with law enforcement, the medical community, loads of community organizations doing all sorts of work, from treatment industry providers to organizations that are involved in policy. We do a lot of government work. We're kind of everywhere. You could check us out also on Twitter and Instagram. And if you look, you can find me on Facebook at under my name, Sean Fogler, and Sean_Fogler is my Twitter and Instagram as well.
We'll be linking all that up in the show notes. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show and sharing your story with us. I think a lot of times physicians, I forgot what it's called, but we're like ducks, right? Seems like we're all calm on the surface, but then you look beneath the surface and we're just kicking and kicking and kicking and kicking. And I think it'll help a lot of people that you were vulnerable enough to share your story and your struggle with us, so that they can relate and realize that what they're going through is what other people have gone through and are going through. And I think that's a tremendous help to know that you're not the only person going through this. You're not alone. And there are people out there that can help. And all the advice that you gave for who to go to and who's been the most helpful in your struggle. So I really appreciate all of that.
Thanks so much.
That was Dr. Bradley Block at the Physician's Guide to Doctoring. He can be found at physiciansguidetodoctoring.com or wherever you get your podcasts. If you have a question for a previous guest or have an idea for a future episode, send a comment on the webpage. Also, please be sure to leave a 5-star review on your preferred podcast platform. We'll see you next time on the Physician's Guide to Doctoring.